So for part 2 of the Introduction to Primary Research video series, I want to talk about different kinds of research because not every study is going to be exactly the same, and depending on what kind of topic you have selected, certain kinds of study are going to be more common than others. Some of you are going to be looking at fields where observational studies will be a lot more common. If you're interested in things like ecology, for example, or other types of fields where observational studies would be more prevalent, that's what you would expect, where there's going to be a lot of surveys or things like that. Psychology, you'd see a lot of surveys, and nutritional studies, you'd see a lot of surveys. Whereas if you're interested in drug trials and medicine, you might see more randomized controlled studies. If you're interested in neuroscience, you're probably going to see a lot of experiments done on rats and that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about different types of study designs. So, types of primary research. There are many types of scientific studies. The methods that researchers select will depend on the nature of the question being investigated. But we're going to broadly create two groups here: experimental types of studies, and hopefully this is what all of your primary research papers will be looking at. I'm hoping for some experiment papers. When I say primary research, I'm not sure if I drove this point home enough. I mean a paper wherein a study was done, written by the original experimenters, and they've done some sort of primary research. They're talking about work that they have done. If it's written about work someone else did, it's not primary research. I mean, written by the scientists themselves. So experimental research. Researchers have some influence over the groups being studied. For example, they're dividing them into experimental and control groups, or they're giving them some new drug treatment, or they are controlling how long they're being subjected to some factor of interest, something along those lines. These studies can establish correlations, we'll talk about that in a bit, and indicate cause and effect relationships, and only experimental studies can do that. As a matter of fact, only randomized controlled studies, experimental studies, can do that kind of thing. However, it is not always possible or ethical to run controlled experiments. You know, these are the kind of limitations we deal with. For example, a lot of psychological experiments, if we wanted to run tests on humans, it's very difficult to get ethical approval to run any kind of psychological experiment which would deal with trauma, for instance, because you would be permanently damaging people. And a lot of medical research as well. You couldn't run a lot of different experiments that would cause any kind of harm to people. Even when you're using animal models, getting approval through ethics boards to run controlled experiments has to go through bioethicists, which are groups of people with experience in both philosophy and setting up biological experiments, who sit on these ethics boards and decides, yes, the value of that experiment seems to be enough to justify allowing animal experimentation, or no, that is not valuable enough in order to get funding or ethics board approval in order to do this. So experimental evidence is really what we want, ideally, in all circumstances, but you can't always have it because it's not always feasible or ethical to run controlled experiments in all situations. So sometimes we go for, instead, observational evidence. And like I said, if you were looking at something like ecology, you might find a lot of studies that are much more observational. No experiment's been run, but a lot of data has been gathered, and maybe enough data has been gathered to be able to reach a pretty strong conclusion just from observation. So this is where researchers collect large amounts of information about some phenomenon, but do not manipulate conditions. We're only there to look and to sample and to write down, not to change. For example, They would not control who is or is not given a drug. These studies can establish correlations, but not establish cause and effect. Only randomized controlled trials can do cause and effect. Now, let's talk about correlation. Correlation is when there seems to be coherence between two factors that you're looking at, when there seems to be a trend, when they seem to be co-related, when they seem to have some sort of relationship together. So for example, here we have two data points being tracked through time from the year 2000 to the year 2009. And when you graph them together, these data points seem to trend together. Look, you see as one rises, the other one rises, and they match each other just perfectly. Look, they interweave with each other even. So it looks like there's a relationship between these two data sets. That's what we call a correlation. These two bits of data are correlated with each other. And these two bits of data are per capita cheese consumption as reported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This is real data. And the number of people who die by becoming tangled in their bedsheet as reported by the CDC, who keeps statistics on this sort of thing. And the correlation is really good. This is a really strong R value, which is a measurement of how strong a correlation is. Higher it is, the better. So does that mean that the more cheese people are eating, then they are being maybe more lethargic, so they're spending more time in bed, and then that increases the risk factor of becoming tangled in their sheets and dying by becoming tangled in their sheets? Or maybe having a comfortable bed makes you more likely to crave cheese, and so the relationship goes the other way. But there's also causes you to be more likely to get tangled in your bed sheets. Is that what's going on? You might have the inclination to say, no, I don't think those things actually have anything to do with each other. Something else is going on, and you are correct. This is what we call a spurious correlation. In fact, the name of the website that this came from is called Spurious Correlations. You can actually go, and the person who set this up has a lot of really great ones. And what they've done is essentially just poured through lots and lots and lots and lots of data, and they're looking for data sets that they can lay on top of each other in order to find some really interesting matches. And the funnier they are, the better, right? Honestly. But just because two data sets happen to have a strong correlation with each other does not indicate that they necessarily have anything to do with each other. In this case, it's just a coincidence, right? This is just, we poured through mountains and mountains and mountains of data, and yeah, eventually if you do that, you will find two things that happen to match up with each other, even if they have nothing to do with one another. In other cases, you might find that there is a third factor, what we call a confounding factor, that affects both of the other things that you are measuring. So it's not the two things that you're measuring, the two things that you're looking at that are actually correlated with each other. It's this third element. When I was taught this, the classic one that I've heard multiple teachers reference before, so I'll use it as well, is that there is a correlation between the sale of ice cream and traffic jams. The more ice cream that we sell, the more time people spend in traffic. The more time people spend in traffic, the more ice cream that's selling. And that causes people to say, "Oh my goodness, does people sitting in their car make them crave ice cream, or does people buying ice cream and do they spill it on themselves, and then they're trying to clean it up and they don't see the green light, and then that slows down traffic? What's going on there? Is that the correlation?" No, ice cream sales go up in the summer, when it's hot and people want ice cream, and road work, construction work, also it happens in the summertime, and that's when you have traffic jams. So there's a confounding factor, summertime, which is affecting both of these other two things. So ice cream sales and road work or traffic jams have nothing to do with each other. It's this third thing that is influencing both of them. So this brings us to the idea correlation is not the same as causation. And on that earlier slide, we said observational studies can establish correlation, right? You can take in lots of data and you can say, these two things are correlated with each other. The number of, the amount of this kind of plant on the underbrush of a forest is correlated with the pH of the soil, right? That's correlated, but that does not establish a causal relationship. Only experiments can establish that, because in an experiment, you can change one of those factors and watch and see if that alters the other one. You can see if there is a cause and effect relationship. But just through observation, you can only establish that there's a correlation, and that does not necessarily imply that there's actually a causal relationship. So you want to be skeptical. And whenever you see results, you have to consider whether or not those results are being reported honestly, or whether or not they've been through all of the rigor that they need to go through. So one idea, and I have a video in this playlist that talks about this in a little bit more depth. There's an idea called p-hacking. Some scientific studies will do something not entirely dissimilar to what this person is doing here. They will gather lots and lots and lots of data. And if you do enough of that, eventually you will find two data sets that match up with each other enough to meet the criteria of statistical significance. And then you'll say, aha, it meets the criteria, that's publishable. And you publish a paper and it says, drinking 20 cups of coffee a day increases your IQ. Something like that. And it's a totally spurious correlation, but you went through and found the arbitrary data that would demonstrate that. That's called p-hacking. We look for in the peer review process. So this is where I have another one. Has the study been peer reviewed? So if it's published in a scientific journal, hopefully all of the papers that you guys are reading have been published in scientific journals, and therefore they have been through the peer review process. So we have people who are looking for exactly that type of problem. Then it shouldn't have any of that. That's why, again, we're also going to be looking for experimental results as well, where hopefully the risk of that kind of thing would be a little bit lower. Not perfect, though. So you have to critique how experiments are set up, because sometimes they can be vulnerable to either conscious bias or unconscious bias by the experimenters. Small sample sizes are another thing you're going to want to keep an eye out for. If I were to take 3 random people from a population, I was doing a study on strawberry allergies, and just by random chance, the 3 people I happened to select had a strawberry allergy, I would not be able to say, well, therefore 100% of the population is allergic to strawberries, right? Small sample sizes can give you statistically unusual results. So you want a big sample size to kind of balance out those, what you might call stochastic errors, statistical problems that pop up with tiny sample sizes. Look at the experimental design. Look at the methods section of your primary research article and figure out if there's any sources of error that maybe the scientists didn't think about, or bias that maybe the scientists hadn't considered. Any ways that you could think of to improve their experimental design. Read the results, read their conclusion, and read all these other parts of the paper and say, hey, the conclusion that they came to, does that actually accord with what the rest of the paper said? Do their results actually imply what they say their results imply? Most of the time, probably they do, because most scientists are not going to make any big jumps in logic from their results. They're just going to say, these are our results, and it clearly shows that exactly this very narrow thing within our field, and this is how it ties in to the broader literature. But I have seen papers where they have made very large leaps in their statements about what it implies. And I've even seen ones where I kind of forget what the paper was claiming now. I wish I had saved a copy, but it said in the conclusion, although our results failed to meet the criteria of statistical significance, they clearly demonstrated that blank, and I forget what the result they were claiming that they had demonstrated was. But if a result does not meet the criteria of statistical significance, then it does not clearly demonstrate whatever it was that they were trying to say. That is the same as saying, even though the coin came up 100 times heads and 100 times tails, it was totally 50-50, we still think that this is a trick coin that will show up heads most of the time in our gut, regardless of what the numbers say, right? Like, they just totally ignored the results of their experiment and their statistics and then made a conclusion independently. So read their conclusion and see if it actually accords with what the rest of the paper says. Has the study been peer-reviewed? If it's in a major journal, then yeah, it has been peer-reviewed. And pretty much any journal that you're going to get out of the database will probably be a peer-reviewed journal. But just to make sure, you're going to send me your sources ahead of time so I can look at them. So you will be good on that. And then here's a good one. Have the results been replicated? This is a really important step in scientific papers. Results can't just stand on their own. I've said it before. The results of a single experiment it's interesting, but it doesn't count for a whole lot by itself. You have to look at it in the broader scientific context. You need scientific consensus before you can say anything. Like a single paper that comes to an interesting result can be groundbreaking, but you'll always notice that scientists are hesitant to adopt something that forces them to totally restructure the theory or the model of how they've been approaching things, because we know the way that we run statistics and the way we design experiments, that problems can pop in. So we need to wait for there to be replication studies and for sources of error to be analyzed and for other teams to come to similar conclusions and for a consensus to be established before we start saying, yes, okay, actually that is the new direction that we're taking things in. So have the results been replicated? Something that you could consider. All right, let's talk about more specific types of studies you might see. So I told you that there's observational studies and there's experimental studies. In general, experimental studies are stronger in results than observational studies. Ooh, I have a scale here. Okay, I'm going to remove my face. There we are. I'm going to remove my face here so you can see this. So stronger results at the top, weaker results at the bottom. Experimental results are stronger in terms of quality of scientific evidence, but again, not always ethical or practical to do an experiment, so we use the best information we can in each case. Now, these types of experiments have different subcategories, of which I'm just going to tell you about a few. First one up is a case study. In the overall hierarchy of the strength of scientific evidence, you have, you could think of like an anecdote as the lowest of the low. An anecdote is just like a story, right? You hear like, oh, well, my My cousin switched to this diet and they lost 5 pounds in a week. That's the weakest evidence possible, because there's no corroboration, and no statistics, and no expert opinion on it at all. Next up from an anecdote would be expert opinion. So you ask your doctor and they'll tell you about a diet or something like that. But then once we actually get into studies, case study is right down here. A case study is kind of like an anecdote, but it's better than anecdotal evidence. It's a detailed history of a specific case. So this is where a scientist or a group of scientists is keeping track of a very specific incident. Say someone has contracted a disease, and they're writing down all of the details of the progress of the disease over the course of that person's life, or maybe something really unusual has happened to that person. So in neuroscience classes, they talk about Phineas Gage, who was a guy who worked with explosives. He was tamping down explosives with an iron bar, and the dynamite went off and the bar shot through his head, took off a portion of his brain, and changed his personality. So there was a detailed case study about the specific way in which his brain was damaged and how that affected his personality. So this is where it says possibly n equals 1. N is the sample size. 1 is the number of subjects. So that would be a sample size of 1, that one guy going around. So a case study is like anecdotal evidence, except that it's very, very detailed and it's being conducted by someone with a scientific background in order to write it all down. But we talked about how low sample sizes are problematic for any kind of study. So this is the lowest sample size possible. Now, it's not necessarily a sample size of 1. You could have a case study where you're tracking, one family and following their case all the way through for a while. But it's generally going to be a history of a very specific circumstance. Next level up, we have a cross-sectional study. Usually you use surveys in a cross-sectional study. You're looking to establish the prevalence of some condition within a population. Say you're looking for trying to figure out how common a certain type of cancer is inside of a population within this city. You're going to hand out a whole bunch of surveys and ask people to send them in. This is an observational study. You're not conducting any kind of experiment. You're just trying to gather information and hoping that people will bring in as much information willingly as they possibly can. And you are only going to get a portion of that population to respond. So it's a cross-sectional study trying to figure out what's going on in that population. Case control study. This is what we call a retrospective study. This is where we're going to take a group of people who have developed some condition and a group of subjects who did not develop that condition, and we are going to compare the risk factors that they were exposed to over the course of their lives. We're going to ask them a bunch of questions and try to figure things out. Let's say we have a whole bunch of people who developed lung cancer and a whole bunch of people who did not develop lung cancer, and we'll say they're all in their 60s or so. And for all other things, for income and education and location and all other factors, they're pretty much the same. The only difference between them is going to be whether or not they developed lung cancer, and we're just going to ask them a bunch of questions about what risk factors they've been exposed to. So it's a retrospective study in that we are looking back over their lives, and we're trying to figure out, like detectives, trying to figure out what happened to them. And maybe we'll find that the people with lung cancer spent a lot more time smoking, or more frequently were heavy smokers than the people who did not develop lung cancer, or maybe some other type of risk factor. Now, I said develop a condition here because a lot of times when you read about studies, the information is aimed at people in the medical fields because you usually think about experiments in medical contexts, but it could be any kind of condition that you like. This is I wrote it to be more general. Then we have a cohort study. This is what we call a prospective study. This is looking into the future, not retrospective. So information is collected by following a single group of subjects over an extended period. Say, every baby born in this particular hospital on this particular day, we are going to write down all of their information and we're going to check in with them every year or so. We're going to get information from their physicals. We're going to get information from like their grades. We're going to get information. We're going to just check in with them. We're going to send them surveys in the mail. Some of them are going to die over the course of the study. Some of them we're going to lose touch with, but we're going to have a big group of people who are going to follow them over a long period of time, and we're going to see how their health or how what other kind of factors we can study are going to develop over time. So we're looking into the future with these cohort studies, and there are some very large cohort studies going on where they're looking at pretty big groups of people over a long period of time. Now, these are getting stronger. You can see how these studies are getting more and more specific and more rigorous over time. Now we're going to get into some experimental type studies. A pre-experimental type of study. This is where an experimental treatment is administered and results are recorded, but there was no control group for comparison. Usually you don't read about too many of these. This is a situation where you have, say, a group of people and you give them all baby aspirin, and it seems like they have lower rates of heart disease as a result than typical for, say, men of their age category, but you didn't have a control group for comparison, so these are not rigorous experimental results, but a pre-experimental setup like this might highlight some interesting ideas that you could look into in the future. So this might be a valuable pre-experiment, something to push you in the correct direction at some point in the process. Then you have something called a quasi-experimental setup, or a non-randomized controlled study. This compares experimental and control group outcomes. All right, so we're getting into a real experiment here, but group assignment is non-random, used when natural groups already exist or random assignment is impractical. So we talked about experimental and control groups before, so you guys know about that. But in a proper experiment, in a randomized controlled study, we would randomly put subjects into each group. So if you were participating in the experiment, you should have an equal possibility of ending up as in the experimental group or in the control group. But in a quasi-experiment, a non-randomized controlled trial, you may already be in one group or the other. For example, if we were testing something along gender lines, right? In that case, you don't really have an experimental and a control group. You just have two different natural groups that exist. Or if you were running a psychology experiment and you wanted to test personality types, like Myers-Briggs personality types, and you wanted to test some factor about them, they're already sorted into those groups. These are facts about the subjects that are not something you could randomly assign them into. Maybe you have two different towns and you are running an experiment where, these two towns are fairly identical, And it wouldn't be practical to randomly assign people to towns. They already live where they are, but we're going to call town A the control group, and they're going to receive no treatment, and town B is the experimental group, and they're going to get something, fluoride in the water or a new playground or something, and we're going to measure the results of the effect on this town as compared to the other one, right? So you have a non-random group assignment in this kind of experiment, and these might be useful. Now, you could have simultaneously these non-random groups, and you could also divide people into experimental and control groups as well. So you could divide them into further subcategories where you have, if we were doing along gender lines, right, you could say, okay, we're going to do the ability to throw a dart and hit a dartboard, but between males and females. And then we are going to also test the effect of having caffeine right beforehand. So we will have a control male group where they've had no caffeine, and an experimental male group where we've given them caffeine, and then a control female group and an experimental female group as well. So you can cut them into different sections like that. And then we have the gold standard, the randomized controlled study, the randomized controlled test. Test subjects are randomly assigned into experimental and control groups to avoid confounding factors. The idea is if every single participant has an equal chance of being in either group, then any kind of factor that may be hiding behind the scenes that we don't know about is going to be evened out between the two groups. So in the example where I had two towns, maybe there's some feature of the genetics or environmental factors of those two towns that the experimenters are not aware of that would affect the results of the experiment. In a randomized controlled trial, you wouldn't have to worry about that so much. It's not a perfect system for eliminating that kind of confounding factor, but it helps. It definitely helps a lot. In a double-blind study, even the scientists will be unaware of group assignment. You usually see this in drug trials, where the control group is being given a placebo, and the experimental group is being given the experimental medication. And there is some system for allocating the subjects the correct medication that they're supposed to be receiving, but even the scientists handing out the medication do not know who is getting the placebo and who is getting the real medication. That's only revealed after the study has been completed and they're checking the results. So randomized control studies, these are considered top-tier experimental results. Now, it gets even stronger than that when you have a meta-analysis, which I talked about last time. When you have a systematic review and meta-analysis, that's where you really have strong results because, again, we're looking at scientific consensus. Single studies, they have differing levels of strength on their own, but a single study is still a single study. When you have the meta-analysis, now we're beginning to see consensus, and that's the strongest thing of all.